Gunnar Henderson left Friday's spring training game after one inning with the training staff. But I'm here to tell you why it is not time to panic. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, February 28th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to break down a couple of injury issues that have popped up over the past day or so for the Orioles in camp, involving two of their most important hitters in Gunnar Henderson and Jordan Westburg. Plus, get you a few more notes from the Orioles spring training game on Thursday. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started today. And thank you to the everydayers and the listeners out there who make Locked On Orioles your first listen of the day. Wherever you download the show, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, make sure to subscribe. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and a review. That really helps the show. And of course, here at the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you to everyone in the YouTube comments and via email. Remember, you can reach out to the show, lockedonorioles@gmail.com, who gave their thoughts about what I should talk about here on the Friday episode. Because when I finish the Thursday episode, make sure to check that one out if you haven't already. We broke down Tomoyuki Sugano's first appearance in Orioles spring training, among other notes. And I talked about how, hey, the Orioles were having a spring training game Thursday. There was no broadcast. There was no StatCast. There was probably not going to be much to talk about from it. And I figured, hey, we'll either do some positional previews. We'll do the Adley season review. I kind of gave you the choice, and we got votes from both sides. And then we had a bit of a scare in Thursday's game. Despite not getting any information except for beat writers, it's a good thing the beat writers are there, because Danielle Allentuck of the Baltimore Banner was on it first, that Gunnar Henderson, after grounding out his first at-bat and making one play at shortstop in the first inning of the Orioles game in Sarasota against the Blue Jays on Thursday afternoon, he left the game after the first with the Orioles athletic trainer. And that, of course, is not a good sign when your MVP candidate is leaving a spring training game. Now, even before we knew what happened, the good thing was, hey, it's spring training. They will pull a guy out of a game for any precautionary reason, because you don't want to risk it at all in games that do not matter. So there's always the chance that a spring training leaving the game is going to be much less of an issue than if it happens in the regular season. And we did find out later in the game that Gunnar Henderson left the game with what the team was calling, quote, lower right side discomfort. Now, teams always obviously take extra caution. Brandon Hyde, when talking to the media after the game, called it completely precautionary, said he was running down the line on that ground out in the first inning, felt a little something running through the bag, and pretty much immediately was like, yeah, I'll come out of the game. And the Orioles were like, yeah, you're going to come out of the game no matter what. We really don't know the full severity of it at this point, but at least the reporting from the Baltimore Banner and what Hyde has said, that Gunnar, at least at this point, is not even going in for an MRI. So if you're not even getting a precautionary MRI just to make sure, that tells me this is on the very, very low end of severity of this kind of injury. Anything that happens, you're going to pull a guy from a spring training game, especially this early in the spring. We're still in February. So I think, it's not like he's going to be definitely back on the field on Friday, but a sigh of relief, I think, can come across Orioles fans from that news. We don't know for sure yet. We don't know how long he'll be held out if he is, but it doesn't seem like something too severe. Remember, Gunnar Henderson was sidelined with what I think was a similar injury early in spring training last year. He came into camp and kind of did not start competing in activities right at the beginning of camp. He had left oblique soreness. He didn't play in his first spring training game until March 4th last year, and was still plenty ready for opening day 3 weeks later. So, he's coming out of the game February 27th. If he misses a couple of days, he's going to be totally fine. Obviously, that is the hope, that this is just a short-term thing for Gunnar, and that's most likely what it will be. But it did get me thinking, like, hey, not that it's going to be some sort of long-term injury, but even if this were something that nagged Gunnar and, he had to start the season on the injured list and he missed a couple of weeks, he missed the month of April, whatever it may be, like what would the Orioles do in their infield if they didn't have Gunnar Henderson for a little bit? And it doesn't just have to be, an IL stint to start the season because of this side discomfort. It could be at any point in 2025 if Gunnar has to hit the injured list for whatever reason. Thought it was a good thought exercise on like what would the Orioles do if he were on the IL, at least to start the season. We can talk about it like this. Right now, your projected infield is Ryan Mountcastle, Ryan O'Hearn, Jackson Holliday, Jordan Westberg, Gunnar Henderson, and Ramon Arias. And the rest of your hitters, of course, Adley and Gary Sanchez behind the plate. And then the 5 outfielders I'm projecting right now, Mullins, Cowser, O'Neill, Kerstad, and Ramon Laureano. So that's kind of the projected hitters on the opening day roster. Now, if Henderson were to start the year on the IL in kind of this hypothetical, and again, all the news we've gotten is that that's not going to be the case. This is going to be something short term, and he should be good to go for opening day. First of all, you'd have to figure out who's going to play shortstop because Gunnar Henderson is the everyday shortstop on this team. And I think probably it would be a split between Jordan Westburg and Jackson Holliday manning shortstop because remember, most likely Jorge Mateo, who has kind of been the main backup shortstop to Gunnar when he's been on this roster, Mateo's still recovering from Tommy John surgery on his non-throwing elbow. The way Mike Elias has talked about it, seems most likely Mateo is not going to be ready for opening day. He is most likely going to begin the year on the injured list. So he would be a more seamless transition to have another true and good defensive shortstop on this team. That's not going to be the case because Mateo is going to be out as well. So in a situation where Gunnar would be out to begin the year, you also don't have Mateo. You're probably, for the rest of spring, splitting time between Westberg and Holliday at shortstop, playing them each a lot of innings there in games, and basically parsing out, okay, who looks more comfortable there, or can we do more of an even split at that position? And then really the other one just mostly kind of plays second base, and Ramon Arias would mostly play third base. Now, in terms of the spot on the roster, it would certainly give a better opening to Coby Mayo. We know right now that, he's a big-time prospect. He made his debut at the end of last year. He struggled, hasn't been great so far in spring training, but it's obviously still February. It's still early. But right now, I read off those names. There's currently not a spot open on the opening day roster for Coby Mayo. But if a guy like Henderson hit the IL, it could be a possibility. If you gave the roster spot to Coby Mayo, you could do something like this against left-handed starters. You could have Mayo at third, Westberg at short, and Arias at second. And then against right-handed starters, you could have Arias at third, Holliday at short, and Westberg at second base. You could get those matchups. But really what this would do either way, no matter who else would make the team, it would be a large uptick in playing time for Ramon Arias. Because with Gunnar Henderson healthy, at best, Arias is probably playing against lefties if Holliday sits against them on the short side of a platoon. And at worst, Holliday starts to play every day, and you basically have Westberg at third, Henderson at short, Holliday at second for most games, and Arias is just kind of your utility infielder again. So if Henderson were out, you're looking at Ramon Arias in the lineup pretty much every day, and that is why he is still around on this roster, because he's a veteran guy at this point. He's been in the big league since 2020 and can step up and stick in those positions for you when you need it. Now, if the Orioles did go with the extra roster spot goes to Coby Mayo, there might be a little bit of worry about your shortstop defense because Jackson Holliday still has the chance to be a true shortstop in the big leagues, right? He's 21 years old. He played it in the minors. The O's have now moved him to second because they have Gunnar Henderson at shortstop, but that's what Holliday was drafted as. He played a lot of that in the minor leagues. Jordan Westburg was also a shortstop in college, but again, he's been mostly second base and third base since he has gotten to professional baseball. So there's questions about those two and their shortstop defense. They just haven't done it a lot in the majors. And maybe the Orioles would want like more of a utility defense first true shortstop to take that extra spot on the roster if they didn't have Gunnar. And that's why I don't think it would be 100% that Mayo would get the extra roster spot. I think a guy like Luis Vasquez, the shortstop who they brought over from the Cubs this offseason, or a guy like Livan Soto, who we saw on the roster for some time at the end of last year, who are both non-roster invitees at camp right now. Neither are on the 40-man roster, but I think both of them would be in the mix as well, especially if it was like, hey, Gunnar's going to be fine. He's just going to be on the 10-day IL to begin the year, and then 10 days after opening day, he's going to be activated. I think if that were the case, I think the spot would actually go to Soto or Vasquez. The Orioles would just kind of send them out there. They'd start maybe once or twice in those 10 days. They'd mostly be a bench player. You could play Westberg and Holiday at short for a week and a half and then get Gunnar back. Where Mayo would fill in more so as if it was some sort of longer term injury for Henderson, where, maybe you weren't going to have him for all of April and beyond, and you wanted more of the offensive upside potential of Kobe Mayo. But Vasquez and Soto gives you more guys who can play shortstop. And then if you went with one of those guys, you would just play Arias at third, Holiday at short, Westberg at second, or some combination of that basically every single day in the infield, and Vasquez or Soto would fill in when you needed them. There's also a situation where maybe the Orioles aren't caring as much about the shortstop defense. They'd be comfortable with Westberg or Holiday at that position. And Arias has played shortstop before, so he has the potential to do it as well. But they don't think Kobe Mayo is ready to get that chance again in the big leagues. That would be a possibility. And I think that's where someone like Emmanuel Rivera, who also, again, is not on the 40-man, but is in camp as a non-roster invitee, swung the bat well so far in spring. And we know how well he swung the bat down the stretch for the Orioles when they grabbed him off waivers last year. Could potentially fill in and play some of that third base and a little first base against lefties as well. And I know people would want Kobe Mayo to get this roster spot, but I truly think if it was like a short-term IL stint for Henderson, my guess would actually be that Luis Vasquez, who had looked fantastic defensively at shortstop, gives you another right-handed back. I actually think he would be the guy who would be on the roster for a few days if it was just something quick for Henderson, and then he could be ready. But again, all signs, everything we've heard so far since the injury happened on Thursday is that he's going to be good to go. Might take him a couple of days off, but think breathe a sigh of relief. Gunnar Henderson will be fine. But he's not the only Orioles infielder who's dealing with something right now. Jordan Westburg hasn't played in a few days now. It's been since the weekend, since Westberg got into a game. It's because he's dealing with a little back discomfort. That's maybe a little more serious than what is going on with Gunnar. So we'll talk about that outlook and what the Orioles would maybe do without Westberg. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. And the live betting at FanDuel is a great feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Looking for a late game rally, picking a player to hit a clutch three, you never miss your chance, and the app is so easy to use. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So as we continue on with the injury updates from Orioles camp, we haven't seen Jordan Westburg in a little while now. It's been since the weekend since he has played in a game for the Orioles, and we found out on Thursday that Westburg has been dealing with some lower back soreness. He is currently undergoing treatment, and he will not swing the bat for at least a couple more days. So hopefully, it's he gets back into baseball activities next week, and by the end of next week, he is back into spring training games. But that seems at least slightly more serious than what Gunnar Henderson at least felt in the game on Thursday, because Westberg hasn't played in a little while, and we finally found out what it was for Jordan. Now, that's not to say that he's not going to be ready for opening day. Again, as I mentioned, Gunnar Henderson had a little injury, didn't play in a spring training game until March 4th last year, was plenty okay and good to go for opening day. Westberg, even if this nags at him for a little bit, still has plenty of time to be ready for the opener on March 27th. I'm not, just like with Henderson, I'm not really super worried about Jordan Westberg at the moment, but he is an everyday player for this Orioles team, a very important part of this lineup. And when he broke his hand last year and missed 2 months, we saw how important he could be with how much the Orioles struggled in the 2 months that he was out. So it's certainly something to talk about with Westberg. Now, if you're thinking about, hey, does Jordan Westberg have to start the year on the IL? It's kind of similar stuff to if Gunnar were out. Let's, take a scenario where Gunnar Henderson's fine for opening day, but Jordan Westberg has to start the year on the injured list. What would the Orioles do at that point? Well, I think the spot would more likely go to Kobe Mayo than it would if Henderson were the one that was on the IL like we talked about before. Because with Henderson healthy, you have a true shortstop. You're more so looking to fill in at third base if Westberg is out. And that's just a better roster fit for Coby Mayo, who, although the Orioles have talked about maybe wanting to play him at first base more than third, he is, at least coming up through the minor leagues, a third base prospect. So if you gave that spot to Coby Mayo, against left-handers, you'd play Mayo at third, Henderson at short, and maybe Arias at second with a little Holiday. And then against right-handers, probably Arias at third, Henderson at short, and Holiday at second, although you could play a little bit of Coby Mayo over Arias at third base as well. It just gives more space for Mayo to play. You still get Arias in there. You still get Henderson in there at shortstop every single day. You kind of have still Jackson Holiday as that backup shortstop. You have Arias if you need him. You don't need to worry as much about having good shortstop defense to back you up because you still have Gunnar Henderson in there every single day. Now, it would still mean a lot more at-bats for Arias. That's the big thing for him. He's sitting in that utility infield role right now. If any of these guys were on the IL, it's a lot more playing time for Ramon Arias. And again, he did hit a 2-run homer in Thursday's game, and that's kind of why he is still on this Orioles roster and so can be a big part because if anybody gets hurt, and we saw it last year, he can fill in pretty nicely. And if the Orioles were in this situation, but they did feel like, hey, Coby Mayo's had a rough spring. We want him to go back to AAA to work on some stuff. He's not quite ready. I don't think the Orioles would jump right to the Livan Sotos or Luis Vasquez's of the world like they would if Henderson were hurt. I think they would go directly to Emmanuel Rivera in this stint. I think, to play third base, to play some first base, to be a right-handed hitter, a pretty good defender, I think they would just go right to Rivera if they didn't want to put Mayo on the roster to be the replacement for a guy like Jordan Westburg. And then again, you would mostly play Arias, Holiday, and Henderson every day, but against some lefties, you'd probably throw Rivera in there at third base and feel okay about that and could pinch hit him with a guy like Jackson Holiday later in the game. Now, since we're talking about the possibility of each one starting the year on the IL, which again seems very unlikely, it looks like at this point, the way they're tracking, both are going to be fine by opening day. It's just they're banged up now. It's something to talk about. I guess we should at least pose the scenario of like the worst case scenario where both Jordan Westburg and Gunnar Henderson start the season on the injured list. In that case, I mean, that's obviously worst case scenario, but in that case, Coby Mayo absolutely gets one of those now 2 open spots on the roster. Like if you get 2 open spots with those guys, you're giving a spot to Mayo. You just have to for the upside. You're losing 2 of your top 4 hitters probably if Westberg and Henderson are injured. So yeah, one of them is going to Mayo. And then I think probably Livan Soto or Luis Vasquez would get the other spot because you give the offensive upside to Mayo with one of them, and then you get the more sure-handed defender who can play everywhere, utility guy on the bench in Vasquez or Soto, you give to the other spot. And then in terms of how you align the infield, I think honestly it's Coby Mayo at third base, Jackson Holiday at shortstop, Ramon Arias at second base pretty much every single day. And you get Mayo a lot of important at-bats to kind of work through some stuff at the plate. And then whether it is Vasquez or Soto, whichever one they would choose, that's a guy who you throw in there once a week to get a start, to give some guys some rest, get them off their feet and keep them fresh. But that would be, you'd get a lot of those young guys. You'd get Holiday and Mayo on the left side of the infield every single day until Westberg and or Henderson got back. It would be definitely interesting. It would be not a spot the Orioles certainly want to be in, but at least they have a plan, right? Even with, trading away Connor Norby and Joey Ortiz and losing more of that infield depth, they've brought in some guys. And, if you've rolled your eyes at the acquisitions of Livan Soto and Luis Vasquez and some of the other guys they've brought in, like, Jordan Adams and Franklin Barreto and Jeremiah Jackson and these other guys they've gotten, Nick Gordon this offseason, this is why you do it, because guys get a little banged up in spring training. They get banged up throughout the season. You don't have as much young prospect depth in the infield in AAA anymore. So you fill it with these guys who, Vime Almachine is one of them who's had a great spring training so far. He's on that list as well. You fill your roster, your NRIs, your Norfolk roster with minor league deals with guys who are veterans, who have big league experience, who are okay being backups and sitting in AAA for a while, but will jump at the chance if you potentially give it to them to jump out there and take some at-bats, fill in when you need them. That is why you bring in all this depth in case something like this happens to Henderson and Westberg, and it's more serious than we think, and they actually do have to miss some time. Again, all signs pointing to both of them are going to be fine for opening day, and that is certainly what the Orioles want, but they will be ready with a plan if that does not end up being the case. But there was still a game Thursday, right? There was no broadcast. There was no StatCast. We got a couple of video clips, but there was some good stuff that happened in the Orioles 11-8 win over the Blue Jays on Thursday. So we'll talk about a little bit of the notes from spring training from Thursday to finish off the show. That's coming up next. So a couple of Orioles news and notes from Thursday in Sarasota to finish off this episode. We start with Felix Bautista, who threw his second live bullpen early in the day Thursday. Brandon Hyde has talked about how the Orioles aren't going to immediately put Felix into Grapefruit League games. He's going to do most of his work on the backfield. So coming off the Tommy John, they can control it, right? If you're in a game scenario, it's kind of harder to pull a guy at a specific pitch count. When you're on the backfield, you can kind of do whatever you want. And so he faced Gary Sanchez and he faced Heston Kjerstad and others in a live BP on Thursday. And videos looked good. He said he felt good. And that was his second live BP. Brandon Hyde said after it, he likes a reliever to get 7 innings in spring. He said that could either be Grapefruit League game innings or live BP innings before he feels he is ready for opening day. Well, it's February 27th and Bautista's already gotten 2 out of 7. So if he stays on this path, while I still think there's a possibility he does start the year on the IL, if he stays on this course, Bautista might be ready to go for opening day, returning the mountain to that Orioles bullpen, which would certainly be exciting. The velocity we've heard about, like he hasn't been back up to the 101, 102 miles per hour. He's been more sitting in the high 90s right now, which is with his fastball, which is fine. You'll certainly think he'll get to that. And even if he's only 100 instead of 102 coming off Tommy John, there's still so much ride on that fastball. That splitter is one of the best pitches in baseball. He'll still be one of the best closers in the game, even if he's throwing 100 instead of 102. Grayson Rodriguez made his first spring start on Thursday, an inning and 2/3 scoreless for Grayson. We've talked about how he is bringing back his sweeper potentially this year, a pitch he threw in 2023 but didn't throw it all last year. Rock Kabako of Masson reported that Grayson threw one single sweeper in his inning and 2/3 and got a swing and miss on it on Thursday and said he felt good about the pitch he threw. So excited for him to throw more games, maybe with StatCast or video involved, and see him throw more of those sweepers and see what that pitch can do. Chase McDermott has been shut down from throwing with a bit of a lat issue, but Rock wrote the other day that he's not throwing yet, but he's feeling a lot better physically after he was shut down. So hopefully maybe next week at some point, Chase McDermott starts to throw again. And he's not a guy who's going to be on the Orioles opening day roster. He'll begin the year in the Norfolk Tides rotation, but the earlier he's healthier, the better the O's can continue to work with a guy who at this point is probably their top pitching prospect, and hopefully get him to help them in the big leagues, whether that's as a starter or a reliever at some point in 2025. Nathan Webb, a guy who the Orioles last offseason signed to a 2-year minor league deal because he was coming off of Tommy John surgery. He then recovered from the Tommy John last year and then tore his Achilles while he was rehabbing Tommy John. So that kept him out for all of last year as well. He is finally back. Unfortunately, his first outing in an Oriole uniform. Again, no video, no StatCast, but the report is he went 1-2-3. Rock reported that the fastball was at 94, the ones he saw. And just kind of really cool for Nathan Webb. Again, not a guy who's going to make the opening day roster, probably going to be in Norfolk or maybe even Bowie's bullpen at the very beginning of the year, just because he hasn't pitched in 2+ years at this point. Like, I think it's been almost since 2022 since Webb has really pitched. So they may even start him at Bowie just to get some confidence to get his feet going. But if he shows the stuff he did back then before the 2 injuries, like could be a legitimate bullpen piece. So intrigued to get a chance to see him throw the next time he does. And then this might feel like a broken record that I'm talking about him again, but I feel like I've mentioned Samuel Basallo, the Orioles' top prospect, on every single episode so far since spring training games have started, at least every single kind of spring news and notes episode. But it's for good reason. Samuel Basallo hit his first spring home run on Thursday. We got some good video of it from the Orioles player development. I mean, took a high fastball and absolutely demolished it well over the center field fence for a 2-run home run late in Thursday's game. It did come off AAA reliever Nick Fraze. So again, not a big league pitcher, a guy who was in AAA last year. So some of the guys that Basallo has been used to hitting, although a guy who's much older than Basallo, and he's used to facing pitchers much older than him because he's only 20 years old at this point and has already gotten 20+ games in AAA. And I just continue what I've said about Basallo. Like he's not going to be on the opening day roster. You're not going to see him early this year. There's still things for him to learn. He still needs to master AAA, still defensive benchmarks to hit, but the bat is just so good. I see him being an Oriole in September of this year, even if it's just as a DH and a bench bat. It's such a special bat. He has showed it off. He is mashing the ball so far as a non-roster invitee in big league spring training. His defense is getting better and better. I feel like, again, a broken record. I'm saying the same thing on every episode, but Samuel Basallo, there is a chance that maybe not as an all-around player because he's going to be limited defensively because of his size, and you don't know if he'll stick at catcher long-term, but as a pure hitter, he could end up being maybe the best prospect to come out of this Mike Elias rebuild. And again, I know that sounds crazy because it's like Gunnar Henderson finished 4th in MVP voting last year. It'll be hard to cross over Gunnar Henderson. But just as a pure hitter and the damage he could do, there is the ceiling there that he could be better as a pure hitter, not as a all-around baseball player, but pure hitter than Gunnar Henderson, even if he's like a DH down the road for the Orioles. That is how high the upside is for this kid who doesn't look like a kid. He's a full-grown man out there at just 20 years old. I don't want to push him, but I cannot wait to get him and see him in the big leagues. It is a special, special talent. And that is kind of the first fruits of the labor of the Orioles finally diving into the international market, signing Samuel Basallo under Kobe Perez and Mike Elias, developing him, and now getting him in 2025. Like, he is on the doorstep. He could debut this season at 20 years old. A special talent who they kind of stole away from the Yankees. He was originally signed with the Yankees, then reneged on that deal. The Orioles were able to scoop him up, and that is certainly worked out for Baltimore, and hopefully he gets to the bigs and crushes the Yankees for years and years to come. But that'll do it for today's episode. That'll do it for this week on the pod. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will be back on Monday with a fun episode because remember, Orioles play spring training game all 3 days this weekend. Friday at the Twins, that game, no broadcast, but there is StatCast. Saturday at home against the Pirates, no StatCast, but there is a broadcast. And then Sunday at the Phillies, there's a broadcast and there is StatCast. So we're going to have a lot of video and a lot of data from those 3 games to pour over when I return on Monday's episode. So you are not going to miss that one. And then next week on the pod, we'll finish up season reviews for Jackson Holliday and Adley Rutschman, and then start some of those positional previews for the Orioles heading into 2025. Again, that's next week on the podcast. It starts back here on Monday. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.